a lot of therapists did ask someone for help initially. And that first supervisor they asked for help told them something like, you should know this already. It's not my job to teach you how to write notes. And
Wow.
so for a lot of therapists, they had this early experience of it is shameful to even admit that you don't know what you're doing or to ask for help around it. And then it becomes this perpetuating cycle. And then those people become supervisors and then they feel unprepared, right? So,
Right.
yeah, so it's really sad. It's a really, really sad, I just hear so many sad stories of other therapists kind of perpetuating this and of so many people feeling the same thing and not understanding that like 500 people around them are feeling the exact same thing.
Welcome to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. This episode is sponsored by the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. Hi, I'm Janine Wolf, and I'm your colleague down the hall. I have a passion for helping fellow therapists get the clinical and collegial support we all need to do this work. And wow, it just keeps getting harder every day. I'm the founder and facilitator of the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. I have been a social worker for almost 30 years, and I own a successful solo online private practice. More of us than ever are practicing in solo or online practices, and we all need colleagues to process cases with, commiserate with on those really hard days, and also to celebrate our successes with. In this podcast, I'll bring you insights about trends and changes in our field and sit down with amazing therapists who are doing amazing work. We'll discuss fictionalized cases, ways to practice sustainably, and of course, there will be plenty of laughing. I love laughing with friends. I'm so glad to have you as one of my colleagues down the hall.
Hello, everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I'm your host, Janine Wolf, joined today by Dr. Maelisa McCaffrey. Maelisa is a licensed psychologist, nail design enthusiast, and a multi-passionate entrepreneur. Through her business, QA Prep, she empowers therapists with trainings and consultation on clinical documentation. What I love is that Maelisa focuses on the why behind the usual recommendations and encourages clinicians to think outside the box while also keeping their ethics intact. As someone with ADHD, like myself, who's had to figure out what works through trial and error, Maelisa aims to make sure her trainings are practical while also allowing for plenty of laughter and fun. So today we're going to talk about her area of expertise, documentation and therapy work. This is something that comes up all of the time in any therapist circle that you're in, and there's lots of reasons behind that. We'll touch on some of those today, I'm sure. Welcome, Maelisa.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I like to do for my audience and my consultation group members is to normalize the things that don't get discussed, that we're not necessarily taught in grad school, that we feel major imposter syndrome about. Documentation is probably the top of the list for that because we are not trained in graduate school about documentation, most of us. We get it through our internship, and if they do a good job, you might learn, like really good documentation skills, but if they don't do a good job, then you may not. Is that your feeling as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was the first thing that even got me thinking about doing this as a business, like having a job doing this. I was working in quality assurance, which is like a whole other story how I got into that. And it's not because I'm naturally organized and super good at this stuff necessarily. But the thing I kept hearing over and again, and thankfully I worked at an agency that was really good about training therapists on documentation. Every single time people would come up to me during the break or at the end of the training and say, I never got any training on this. Thank you. This is so helpful. And that was therapists who had recently graduated, all the way to therapists who had been doing this for 15 years, and had worked at other agencies and were coming up and saying the same thing. So when I started talking to, I started thinking like, I wonder if my, friends who have private practices would be interested in this kind of thing, and started asking them like, would you want a training on documentation, or would you like use consultation or something? And every single one of them was like, oh my gosh, that would be so helpful. And, like they had never gotten any training on it either. So it's a really, really common issue. And I think it's important to note that it's common this is not just people who've graduated recently. This is people who have been in the field for 20 years, licensed for 20 years, saying the exact same thing. And it's been this secret shame or source of stress that entire time for their whole career.
Yeah. And again, it's one of these things that we're afraid to ask others about it because we feel like, well, we know that therapists can be judging and shaming at times, which is disappointing, but we're afraid to ask because we feel like, especially if you've been in the field for a while, like, I should know this, like it's too embarrassing. And because they don't ask, then they don't know. And every now and then in one of my consultation groups, someone will say like, oh my gosh, I have to like really own up to something. I'm behind on my progress notes. And I'll say, anyone who's ever been behind on their progress notes, raise your hands, please. And everyone's hands raise up, because that's a common thing as well. It's not a good thing. It's something you need to figure out, but it does happen.
It happens a lot. And one thing I've noticed, so kind of two things based on what you said. One thing I've noticed is that since the pandemic, I've had many more people seeking support with that specific issue of getting behind in paperwork than people who say, I've never had an issue with this before. My entire career, documentation has never been a problem. I've always got my notes done on time. I've even having their own private practice, right? And there's just something about that added stress of the pandemic. And I think that combined with being on the computer so much more than many therapists were used to prior to that, made it this new problem for therapists who never, I've had so many therapists, and this is very new, who are like, I never understood when people would say that they struggle with paperwork. And now I get it. Like now it's me and I feel bad. And related to that is that a lot of therapists did ask someone for help initially. And that first supervisor they asked for help told them something like, you should know this already. It's not my job to teach you how to write notes. And so for a lot of therapists, they had this early experience of it is shameful to even admit that you don't know what you're doing or to ask for help around it. And then it becomes this perpetuating cycle. And then those people become supervisors and then they feel unprepared, right? So, so it's really sad. It's a really, really sad. I just hear so many sad stories of other therapists kind of perpetuating this and of so many people feeling the same thing and not understanding that like 500 people around them are feeling the exact same thing. And they're all just secretly feeling it, not sharing.
Yeah. And I couldn't agree more about the pandemic. I know for myself, when I did agency work, I was always behind on my paperwork. And so when I went into my private practice for the first 4 years, I had developed a system for my little ADHD brain and it was going great. And I was never behind on notes. And now I struggle so much since the pandemic to make myself just sit down and do the note. And then I do it. I'm like, oh my gosh, what is the big deal? I know how to do this note. I just need to do it. So yeah, it has changed so many things in our field, the pandemic. And I'm not sure we've really recovered as a field as far as like the exhaustion and the things that we're dealing with. I still see so many therapists that are struggling in lots of different ways.
Yeah, I would agree. And practically, like our work has changed. So many therapists didn't go back to seeing clients at least full time in an office, right? Many therapists decided they did like the flexibility of online therapy and either do it half time. I would say most therapists are at least still seeing some clients online, whereas that was very unusual before the pandemic, right? And now a lot of therapists are still 100% online. So it's
I actually moved. It is. And I actually moved 100% online in 2019. But even then I was, so I was on my computer all day long, but even then I was still getting my notes done and not struggling. So anyway, so let's shift a little bit and talk about what are some of the common mistakes that you see therapists making, because you do, I don't know if you still do this. At one point, people could set up a time with you and you would actually review their documentation and do like an audit. Is that?
So I do consultations and people consult with me for a variety of reasons, but I would say one of the most common is like, usually they just want me to review their template. Or templates that they have, or review maybe like a treatment plan and a progress note. And we end up doing a whole bunch of things, within that consultation. And there's a lot of, common routes that takes. But yeah, I literally review paperwork, review templates through consultations, and a big, kind of related to what you said, like what are the common mistakes? Over half of my business income now is just from running groups to help people catch up on paperwork.
Yeah. Yeah. Your get notes done day. Yes.
Yeah. Which, I mean, and literally a group, like a support group for people who are behind in their paperwork. It's that much of a struggle, and it's that common. The individual consultations have died down a little bit. And part of that is because I was seeing the same thing over and over and over. And I was like, this is silly. I'm meeting with, 10 people in a week who, 8 of whom are all dealing with the same thing, which is that they're behind in their notes. And they all feel ashamed about it. And they all feel alone in this struggle. And I'm like, I just need to do a group. So I would say just being behind in paperwork is one of the most common issues. Not feeling related to that. There's I have a whole training where I go through the 4 main reasons that people do get behind in their paperwork. But related to that, I think the other big struggle is not feeling confident in the notes that they're doing. So I also meet with people who spend, half an hour on every note, and people who are getting their documentation done, but it's a huge source of stress for them because they sit there and rewrite things and overanalyze and question everything that they're writing and catastrophize into like how this note is going to destroy their client's life in some way, or show how awful of a therapist they are. I would say those are kind of the 2 big, underlying fears around it. So it's one of the big mistakes, I think, is like spending all this time on notes. And although documentation is really important, overemphasizing the importance of each individual note and kind of using that, like it becomes this huge story. So getting behind in documentation, overemphasizing that. And then related, there's, a lot of the other practical things like not considering insurance, I would say, is a big one, especially for therapists who don't contract with insurance, but do offer super bills to their clients. Related to that, not discussing with clients the potential ramifications of that, meaning like not understanding themselves what that can mean, and not explaining that to their clients so that they can fully consent to whether or not they want their records potentially open to an insurance company, right? So it's kind of this ignoring that insurance aspect.
And I would say that probably a lot of therapists who choose to do a private pay model for their practice don't understand that about the super bill. They don't want to deal with insurance, and they don't understand that by consenting to give the client the super bill, they are then open themselves up to have to deal with insurance if that case gets audited. And I don't think a lot of people know that.
Yes. Exactly. And it doesn't have to be a big deal, but one of the things I always emphasize is, that's more a client rights issue, and just letting people know what it means if they do want their insurance to pay. And, because it does have potential ramifications. There are people who would choose not to do that if they knew they would then be required to have a mental health diagnosis, for example. And so making sure people know that, and that their records could be released. And if their records aren't released, the insurance company can choose to stop paying for that therapy, right? And so there's all kinds of feelings, and, that can be a really charged issue. And that's why I always kind of keep the focus on, not determining whether or not that's good or bad, or whether or not insurance companies are good or bad. The issue is, this is the reality, and making sure clients understand that, and that we understand what that means for the work we're doing too.
Yeah. And depending on the population you work with, that can be really impactful on somebody's career, having that mental health diagnosis. And so doing a good job of explaining that to the client, like, so you don't want to use your insurance, you're in a private pay, but the super bill actually means you're using your insurance.
Exactly.
And so, yeah.
Yeah. And that can mean, it definitely, and it's not something I'm saying not to do at all. It can mean more flexibility for the therapist, for sure. And I get it. A lot of these insurance companies I would not want to contract with either, but it's just important to remember. So I think a lot of these things have to do with one of the overarching mistakes is kind of putting our head in the sand around documentation, because it's something we don't like to do. It's stressful, it's scary. So it's like, I don't really want to worry about it. I just want to buy this paperwork packet from somebody online and then just like put my name on it and not even look at it and not have to think about anything. And that's like another one of the things I really think is a big mistake that therapists make, is blindly taking advice from others. So for example, like I sell a paperwork packet. Lots of other people sell paperwork packets, right? One of the things I emphasize with mine is I can give you a really good base, but no one has an attorney approved paperwork packet. No one has a paperwork packet that's perfect for you, whoever you are, because guess what? There are either, depending on the state, there are 4 or 5 license types. They may or may not have different boards. So there may be 2, 3, 4 different boards within that state. There are 50 states. All those different states have laws, and that's just within the US. So there's no way I can say my paperwork packet's going to meet all of your requirements. I can say it's going to meet most of them, and it's going to meet all the ethical guidelines, but I don't know all the details. So I kind of, I do highlight common areas where that may change based on profession and state and et cetera. But you have to be, if you're going to have a private practice and do this stuff on your own, you have to be willing to take a little bit of that extra step, a little extra time to review those things and make sure that it is personalized to you. And same with like note templates. I see so many people who are like, you'll hear people say, I thought I was supposed to put this in a note, and I thought I was supposed to put this in a note, and someone told me this, or when I worked at this agency or this group practice, we had to write our note this way. 99% of those are arbitrary guidelines. There are very few guidelines around what goes in a note. And so it does require a little critical thinking about, one, like, what should go in a note for you based on your clients and your profession, but also two, like, what's helpful, what's useful, like make your notes and your documentation useful for you as much as you can.
Right.
So that it's not just this like boring task, like a spreadsheet that you're just filling out, but it's actually something that you can go back and use later.
Yeah. And another area that until I was running my consultation groups, I didn't realize how pervasive this was, but we're also not trained to document our decision-making in ethical gray areas in our work. And I actually have, I did a training for that. It's a framework to teach people how to make those decisions and then document them. And so many people just don't do that. And I'm like, I used to just say consulted with a colleague. And I'm like, that literally does nothing for you if someone is investigating your case, right? And so when I did this training, I reached out to an attorney who's also a therapist. And he said what you said. It depends. You say that a lot, which is true. I reached out.
I went to his training too, and he says that all the time. We were both like, yep, got you.
Yeah. Yeah. I reached out to the Virginia Board for Social Workers and said, hey, where should this type of documentation go? It's when you're getting a consultation. So with the form that I provide my members, they list who was there. And so my concern was if I consult with you and 4 other people, and in my progress note, I've listed like the consultation and who was there, and then a client requests my records, and maybe they're angry with me. And now they have these other people's names that they reach out to. So I'm like, I don't really feel like it's appropriate for the progress note. So the Virginia board basically said, if it's not outlined specifically in our regulations, which it's not, then you need to seek guidance from an attorney. And I was like, but you're the board and you're the one who's going to come down on me if I get this wrong. And you're basically telling me you won't help me, which was so mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. And frankly, they don't. And that's why one of the things I did during like a total ADHD hyperfocus spiral moment was I'm licensed in California. I live in Washington State now, but just kept my California license because that was easier than transferring, unfortunately. But I lived in California for a long time. So, and there's a huge population of therapists that live there. So I analyzed all of the board complaint from like years. In California, there are only 2 boards. So there's the Board of Behavioral Science, which covers everyone except psychologists. And then there's the Board of Psychology. And so I reviewed both. And that was the better way for me to see, like, how do people essentially, for lack of a better phrase, get in trouble related to documentation. Like, does this happen? Because I will say one of the most common questions I get, and it's a fear that people are scared to ask, but it's really common, is like, am I going to lose my license? Either I'm behind on my notes, or are my notes so bad? Am I so bad at writing notes that, like, if there was a complaint, would I lose my license? And I can tell you, at least based on that research, no one loses their license solely on documentation.
Oh, well, that's great to know.
It's mostly what we can imagine, which is like, don't have sex with clients and don't do drugs or drink and drive, right? Those are kind of the big things that come up. Don't have major boundary issues with clients. But, the common things, what came up was just a board needing to investigate a separate issue and then your documentation not explaining what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when people would typically, there were times where the board determined that whatever complaint was not founded, but because the therapist documentation was so poor, for example, like they didn't have an intake assessment at all, or their intake assessment was like a genogram.
Okay.
And that's it. And so there was nothing to explain like why this person was there to get therapy, or, you know, if they had issues, or nothing to justify a diagnosis, and yet the therapist gave them a diagnosis. You know, some fairly basic things that most of the people who consult with me don't have to worry about. But those were the issues where then the board said, you know, take a documentation course or take an ethics training, that kind of thing. Those were usually the biggest ramifications related to documentation from any board. But yeah, the board's not going to tell you anything about like what to do. And a lot of times our laws are more specific, like our state law is more specific than the ethics requirements or the professional standards from our professional associations, which a lot of them just say write notes.
Right.
And they might say write timely notes.
Yeah.
Like, okay, is that today? Is that within a week? Is that within a month?
What is timely? Like, right.
Who knows? So they're really vague standards.
Yeah, absolutely. And we even have things like there's a number of EHRs that people are commonly used in private practice that don't have a place to put the start time and the end time of the session. They just have the time that was set aside for the session. And because that's not there, then people are like, I just got in trouble for this and I didn't even know I was supposed to do this. Yeah.
And that's one of those weird specific things that insurance really likes to harp on and is a little bit newer. It wasn't that big a deal like 15 years ago, but now it is. And just as a practical tip, like what I tell people is just add, if you can adjust your template, just add a section that says actual start and stop time. So that way you can have kind of like the appointment time, but then on your note, you're still writing the actual start and stop time. Or you can just create that as part of your cheat sheet, just kind of start every note by that, saying that actual start and stop time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
yeah. And once you get into the habit of it,
you can't rely on your EHR to have like, that's another thing I tell people a lot. They'll be like, well, how do I do this special treatment? I hate treatment plans and EHRs.
Yeah, I do too.
They're all really complicated. They overcomplicate the thing. And so many people are like, I don't know how to do a treatment plan. And I'm like, well, why don't you just put NA in that section? And they're like, I can do that. And I'm like, yeah, there's no like board approved, state approved, insurance approved treatment plan, like in an EHR. They all just, a lot of times it's like programmers who made it up based on doing research online and then consulting with a couple therapists. So yeah, you can adapt it, but don't rely on your EHR, as you're pointing out, to have the necessary components you might need to have.
Yeah. And that's why I'm a big fan of the EHRs that will let you create your own forms, because it's like, I know the order I want my note in. I know exactly what I want to have for checkboxes and places to type in and all that. And I just don't want to have to like fit my note into your template that doesn't necessarily work for me.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree. And I know a lot of people don't necessarily want to spend the time creating a template or don't feel confident doing that themselves. And that's where like there are lots of templates out there. Lots of them that you can find for free that you can purchase, do that. But yeah, don't necessarily always rely on the EHR, which I guess relates to one really common mistake, which is writing a lot. And so as I'm thinking about a lot of EHR templates, they might have like a basic SOAP note or a basic DAP note, and it just has free text fields, these open free text fields. For a lot of therapists, especially if you don't feel confident in your paperwork, it becomes a free-for-all when you have an open text field, and meaning that you want to write everything and all the things, and that's what leads to rewriting. And like one quick tip to help with that is use bullet points.
Yeah. Like
just start using bullet points in ironically, I try to teach people to take writing out of their progress notes as much as possible. So like use bullet points. If that makes you feel uncomfortable, use phrases, but and just hit enter and make it a new line, put a dash in front of it. But don't feel like you have to write a paragraph that is an organized story of the session, because although you might think like, oh, well, doesn't it need to read this way and be organized? I can tell you, as someone who's read thousands of notes, it is way easier to go back and review something that has some quick points listed rather than to look at, like, as soon as you see a big paragraph of text, none of us want to read that, right? Like, and I can get caught up in the client stories, and I do think it's interesting reading them, but
Mm-hmm.
there's that initial like, oh, I've got to read this whole thing. And you have that same feeling when you're writing it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I've got to write this whole story. It's like writing a paper again.
Yeah.
And so, again, just because your EHR might have whatever setup, you can still adapt within that. You can always put NA. Like there's a really common therapy EHR. I don't know if we're like naming names here or not, but there's a really common therapy EHR that does not allow you to adapt your template at all, and you have to use their template.
Yes.
That doesn't mean you have to fill out all the sections in their template. Even if it's required, you can just put NA, not applicable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Like you have the freedom to do that. And I think a lot of therapists need that permission because it feels required. So many of us, we're good at school. We're good at doing what we need to do. We're good at being good people. And so we see this prompt and we feel compelled to complete it. And
we have to follow the rule.
Yeah.
The rule is that there's a box there. I have to put something in it.
Exactly. And the thing is, you don't.
Okay. That's a super helpful tip.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Okay. So you said to me, when we were coordinating about getting this recorded, that one of the ways that people find you is they search for what goes in a progress note. Mm-hmm. So can you give us a rundown? I mean, and obviously we're taking into account there's different license types, there's different states, there's different insurance companies, all of that. But in general, what are those things?
Yeah, absolutely. And related to that, like all of our professional associations just say write notes. Mm-hmm. Some of them, like my board, so I'm a psychologist, my board has the most detailed, and it says to include things like progress. So, I mean, so your guidelines are vague regardless of who you are. But in general, the things that you want to include, and I'm kind of organizing this based on how my brain thinks of it, but you can organize it however you want. There's no wrong way to organize a progress note or write it in that way. But the general topics that you discussed, which could be as detailed as you including some client quotes, it could be as detailed as you sort of summarizing a story that they told over the weekend, or it could be a list of 3 bullet pointed phrases. Mm-hmm. Discussed childhood experiences, discussed relationship with spouse, discussed communication skills at work. I mean, that would be a lot for one session, but sometimes that happens. But literally that basic. It can be that basic. So in general, like what you discussed with the client, then the interventions you provided, which I always recommend you create a cheat sheet for yourself related to that, because I find that's the area that many therapists focus on the most. And that's where you're trying to translate what happened in the session and what you experienced in the session into a note. And often that is difficult to do. But if you have at the very least a cheat sheet, and I have a free one, I have a free therapy interventions list. You can check,
we'll put that in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah. Even if you're free form writing, but you have that list printed out next to you or open on your computer and you use it as a reference sheet, I guarantee it will be faster. You look at that list and you're like, oh yeah, I did do that. I did do some cognitive reframing. Even if you're not a CBT therapist, you probably did some cognitive reframing at some point, right? There are just certain things but it can be difficult to produce that content on your own. Right. So your interventions, but again, do that as like a bullet pointed type list and use a cheat sheet so you're not using your mental energy to do that translation. And then it would be client presentation. So that would be kind of how your client appeared. I usually say a full mental status exam is not necessary for most private practice clients. Mental status exams were meant for psychiatrists who work in hospital settings, and they're applicable in that setting. For most of us, they're not. But if you want to focus on presentation, like mood, affect, behavior, those are things most of us as therapists are actually paying attention to on a weekly basis. So just kind of thinking through, and that could be one section, client presentation, but you have, and again, those could be things you have pre-created for yourself, either as like check boxes or a cheat sheet that you reference, which are things like, were they tearful? Did they appear sad? Did they appear anxious? Were they restless? Were they yelling? Whatever common behaviors and presentation you see. And related to client presentation is client progress. So for example, like my APA does say that psychologists should include that information in progress notes. And not all of the boards or not all of the ethics professional associations say that. But it's a good thing to include, especially if you ever work with insurance, which means if you also provide super bills, and it can be very quick and easy. But client progress, like literally one sentence, one statement. You can include client quotes, but I usually, like, for example, in my progress note template, I have that as like an optional section. So some therapists I know like to use client quotes, and I encourage it. I think it can be really helpful. And often if you're trying to, again, do that translation of like, how do I convey what the client said? Just use a client quote, right? Just literally write what they said. It's the most objective way to present that information. And then you're going to include a plan. So, when are you seeing them again? Like, when are you following up? If there was some kind of ethical concern or some other issue, or you made a referral or gave them a list of referrals, like, what's the follow-up after this? And it may be just that they're coming back the next session and they're going to implement something during the next week. So that's kind of in general what to include. Of course, there are other things you could include. There might be other things, like if you work with Medicare, I do say like write the literally copy paste the goals from your treatment plan onto every progress note. So there are different nuances, but for the most part, it can be pretty basic.
Right.
And those would be the main things.
Okay. And I think something that you touched on a little bit earlier was speaking in generalizations. So like you're working with someone with childhood sexual abuse. You don't need to describe that. No one needs to have that in a record, but you can touch on the fact that you were working on that with your client. And I think that's when people are writing these really long notes, they're putting in information that really should not be in a note, because an auditor, I'm sure, doesn't want to read it to begin with and be exposed to that trauma themselves over and over. But it doesn't help the client's confidentiality at all that way.
Yeah. And I always explain, like, this is where using process notes, or like what HIPAA would call psychotherapy notes, can be really useful. When you do want to write down some information, but you're like, I don't know if that should be in the progress note, well, use a process note. And most EHRs have like a process or psychotherapy note section. And so if it's technically separate from the client record, it's protected, and it means it's your note. Whereas your progress notes are your client's notes. That's your client's record. They have access to it. They can view it. They should be able to view it. Again, that's a client rights thing. Just like you and I can ask our doctors for our medical records, your clients can ask for their psychotherapy records. What they can't ask for, and what you can literally tell them no, is for your personal process or psychotherapy notes. So that can be a good place to enter what I call like the gory details that sometimes come up in therapy that you might want to save just for your own reference point, or because you thought something would be useful, or for whatever reason, but you don't necessarily need to put in the official record. And if you kind of want a rule for like what, because this is a huge gray area, right? It's mostly gray. Like, well, where does that line end? What do I include? What do I not?
Right.
So a good general rule is, what would another therapist need to actually treat this client, or anything that could potentially relate to like the diagnosis or something that you're doing. So for example, like sexual trauma is a big one. It is relevant to put in the official record if someone experienced sexual trauma as a 6-year-old from a family member versus someone who experienced sexual trauma as a college student when they were 20 years old, from a romantic partner. Those are two very different experiences, but they're both sexual trauma, right? So you would want that level of detail. You don't really need much more detail than that to justify a diagnosis, right? To explain why you might be doing certain types of treatments, to explain why you might be making certain recommendations or have certain concerns. All of those are very relevant, but you do need some detail. Like just saying sexual trauma would still be too broad for any of us to understand the context of why this particular person might be seeking therapy or what might be going on with them.
Okay.
So kind of thinking like, what would another therapist need to either understand why I did something, or to understand why I'm doing this type of care, or to help this person.
Right. Yeah, that's really helpful. I would like to shift into the thing that everyone is talking about these days. And I did a panel with a group of people about the use of AI in clinical documentation. And so you've done some research on that. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. And I listened to that panel, and I actually did a training for person-centered tech.
Okay.
Who, Liath is, what is her title there? at the time. I'm not sure. But
Yeah.
Ryan essentially directs person-centered tech, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
she was on that panel.
The knower of all things is how I
Yes.
think of her.
Yes. The knower of all things HIPAA and technology. So, and a very, very critical ethical thinker, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So I did a training for person-centered tech on AI as well. And yeah, I mean, it's really, really interesting. I will say people listening to this podcast are probably more likely to be interested in it. I found therapists as a group are not extremely tech savvy and are, tend to run a little bit more on the anxious end of things. And so that doesn't usually lend itself to wanting to be the first to adopt new technologies, right? However, I think the people who are like in my community really struggle with documentation. So they're excited about AI and they're like, give it to me. Like I attended an in-person training a few months ago, and the person doing the training said, "Who's excited about AI? Raise your hand." And it was me and him and one other person out of a group of like 150 therapists.
Wow.
Nobody else was excited about AI. So it is interesting. I feel like my community and maybe your community as well is not necessarily the typical therapist regarding this topic. So I'd say that's probably something to consider when you're talking to colleagues about it. But there's a lot of opportunity there. I think it can be helpful. I would say a few caveats, like the biggest trends that I see coming up are, number one, don't use ChatGPT to write progress notes because that's kind of the popular thing that everyone's talking about.
Right.
There are now, like, and a year ago, this was not the case. This is how quickly this is changing. There are paid services you can use that will give you a HIPAA business associate agreement, which essentially is their way of ensuring that they are securing data in a HIPAA secure way, in a nutshell.
Right. Yes.
So, there are services you can pay for who are doing that. There is no free service you can use that is doing that. I can tell you this guaranteed in this moment.
Right. Okay.
So, and related to that, you cannot write an individual therapy progress note without entering PHI. There's no such thing as de-identifying information, entering it into ChatGPT, and getting what would actually be a personalized progress note. If you're including enough information to make it a progress note that relates to a person in a session, then you may not be including their name and age. You're including enough information that should be a concern. So if we kind of look at like ethical guidelines, and it's Wild West. So we're having to use this like ethical decision-making framework.
Yeah.
There are tools that are available that will give your clients data security. So there's no reason other than not wanting to pay to not use those tools.
Right.
So I say that because a lot of therapists are like hearing different things, and I want everyone to know that the options are out there. So if you want to use AI, do it, but use a paid service that says they're protecting your client's data. Use ChatGPT for all kinds of other cool things, like giving you ideas for blog posts and creating templated emails for your business. Like there are all kinds of random things for your practice, or even give me a list of, generate 10 psychotherapy treatment goals that I can use with clients for the clients who have anxiety. That's a generic thing that you can use as a resource for yourself to have on hand.
Right.
There's
or you can have it create a worksheet for X, Y, and Z for a particular population of client.
Absolutely. Like there are so many ways you can use it to save yourself time and energy, but don't use it for progress notes and don't use it to create individualized treatment plans.
Okay.
There are lots of services that can do that for it, that can help you with that.
Absolutely. And I think when I was doing that panel, I did quite a bit of research, and I had no idea that there's like huge hospital systems that are using AI. And the one that kind of freaks me out, which I don't, I can understand like in a doctor's appointment, but not in a therapy appointment. There are ones that will listen to the entire session and then generate the note. And firstly, like I said, I struggle with that personally because I don't feel comfortable, but you would have to get your client's consent for that. That definitely would need to be in your consent for treatment.
Absolutely.
So what are your thoughts about those in behavioral health, the ones that listen in?
So I'm open to it. I think the key is what you said, though, is your client open to it.
Right.
So I've worked with some therapists who have started using some of these services, and some of them have said all my clients were cool with it. Like they were fine. I was surprised. Like I thought maybe I'd be able to use it with some of them, but all of them are fine with it. I mean, that's a best case scenario. They're cool
Yeah,
with it.
absolutely.
But I think presenting it in a way that makes sure that they understand it's optional. It's not something that you can, at this point, it's not something you could say like, well, if you won't let me use this service, I can't see you. That would not be considered ethical right now. So it may be something you can use with some clients and not others, or even in some circumstances and not others. Most of those services, you can also upload like a transcript. So if your client was comfortable with you recording things, and that would be kind of difficult. I think they're probably going to be okay with either like you both, it's kind of like you're using that platform as your telehealth platform. So you both log in to the session and it listens in on your session, and then it produces the note for you at the end of it.
Yeah.
To me, that's the most helpful way to use AI right now. But again, it really does. You need to be comfortable with that. And more importantly, your client needs to be comfortable with it right now. The other piece is another common way that you can use it is you enter in a few sentences or some data into the AI system, and then it gives you a progress note. I've played around with I've actually gotten demo. You can imagine these people are reaching out to me quite a bit. So I've gotten a lot of personalized demos and have access to a lot of these people, and have played around in their systems quite a bit. And the things that come up with that is I have been shocked at how long it takes for the AI to produce the progress note. It's not ChatGPT. If you do it in ChatGPT, it spits it out immediately. That's not what happens in these systems. Okay. They're not ChatGPT, which is good because they're, again, protecting your data at a different level. But I mean, I'm talking like one of them, minutes. It's like hit a button and then like go get coffee, go to the bathroom, then come back and your note's done. So it's not this super quick hit a button and your note is there. The other thing is it will make things up. So it did kind of extrapolate from the data I gave it. So you really do have to review it and make sure that the data, that what it gives you is correct. But more importantly for me, it didn't save any time. Like and even when I've gotten demos from people and when I watch their tutorials, in order for you to have to log into this other system, enter the data into their progress note generator, and then it produces the note for you. It gives you the note, and then you copy paste that into your EHR or into wherever you keep your own records. Like every single time, the information that whomever put into the progress note generator could have just been the progress note itself. So for me, if you have a reference sheet and you have a good template, doing that process is not going to save you any time. You might as well just put those few phrases that you entered into the progress note generator into the actual progress note and hit sign and call it good. So that's one thing I want people to consider. I would say if you're interested in it though, like try it out. Try it yourself, see if it saves you time, see if it saves you mental effort, see if it makes you feel better. But just using that to turn your progress note into what you think sounds more clinical does not actually make the note better. And that's like my opinion as someone who has reviewed a ton of progress notes and looked up all these requirements and everything. I don't see it making better progress notes than the information that the therapist had to input originally.
Yeah. And the ones that listen in, I imagine that could be a time saver, and that could solve the problem of being behind on notes all the time. And we'll have to see what direction that goes. I think the public is going to at some point have to get more open to AI because it's everywhere now.
It is. And it gives you some interest. Like it's not only could it save you time, like it gave some cool insights. Like here are some top highlighted topics that came up that maybe not even that you wouldn't think of it, but again, it's like taking that mental effort and time to like sit there and remember it all. And it also analyzes like how much you talked versus how much the client talked versus which could also be helpful if maybe you do couples work or family work. It analyzes like who is the speaker, and there's some other cool insights it can potentially give you. So it is more than just saving time on notes, although that's a big aspect of it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I try to be as open-minded as I can, and I'm definitely open-minded with AI, but the listening in part is where I'm struggling. But we'll have to see how that develops, because I think people are going to start seeing that in all their doctor's appointments, all of those things where there's any type of note that needs to be generated.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been a great conversation, Maelisa. I want to ask you if you have a favorite catchphrase or analogy that you like to use, you can share with us.
Yes. So one of my favorite catchphrases, which anyone in my community should be able to tell you, is any note is better than no note. And so if you are sitting there and agonizing over whether or not to write a note because it feels so difficult to do, remember, any note is better than no note. If you are sitting there in the middle of note writing and you're like, I don't want to sign it yet because I don't know, just write something down.
Okay.
Your future self will thank you. Get that note in, and get in. A bad note is better than no note at all.
Yeah.
And a lot of therapists get stuck on that perfectionism aspect. And if I can't write a really good note, I'm not going to write a note right now. That's how you create a huge problem.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so freeing. Really, just to hear that from you. It can change your perspective a little bit there. Every note's not going to be your best work.
It won't.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And a note you write for a session today is always going to be better than a note you wrote from a session that happened a month ago.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. This has been really helpful. I feel like we could discuss this for hours because there's so many aspects of this that we need to clarify, tips for getting them done, tips if you're neurodivergent and you need help getting them done, all of those things. But we just don't have the bandwidth for that today. But maybe we can do another session sometime because there's so much about this and it's such an important topic for our own mental health as providers, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So please tell the listeners where they can find out more about you and the things that you offer.
Yeah, you can go to qaprep.com and I have a pretty active blog. You can also check out my YouTube channel, which is my name, Maelisa McCaffrey. You can type it in however you want. It'll come up, but my name is spelled Maelisa. It's a little different. But those would be the two main areas where you can find some really good content. I offer lots of free resources. Like I said, there's a free therapy interventions cheat sheet. So if you want to start there.
And you have a YouTube channel too that has really helpful videos on there.
Yeah. So on YouTube, it's Maelisa McCaffrey. So
okay. All right. Great. Thank you.
Okay. For everyone listening, let me try that again. There are new episodes of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast released every Thursday on all major platforms. Please remember, our work is hard, but it doesn't have to be lonely. Thank you so much for listening to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. For show notes, links, and downloads, head over to colleaguedownthehall.com, where you'll be able to learn more about getting the clinical support you need and resources to help you work in a supported, sustainable way. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share with your therapy friends and colleagues. Subscribe to the podcast, and if you love this episode, please leave a review.